Welcome to this video, which is an introduction to complex numbers. Let's begin. Up until now, we have said that we cannot take the square root of a negative number. However, now we're going to define the square root of negative 1 as I. So, if I were to square both sides of the equation, let's see what would happen. Well, the square root of negative 1 is just negative 1, and the square of I would be I squared. So these are two definitions that you need to commit to memory. The square root of negative 1 is equal to I, and I squared is equal to negative 1. The letter I is called an imaginary number. As we solve equations, the solutions oftentimes contain both a real piece and an imaginary piece. Together, the real and imaginary parts of a solution are called a complex number. So the real part plus the imaginary part is equal to the complex. So we have A plus BI is equal to the complex solution. Again, A is the real portion of our solution. BI is the imaginary portion. Again, recall that I is equal to the square root of negative 1. Let's look at the first example. Simplify the square root of negative 25. So anytime I'm working with a negative radical, the very first thing I always have to do is I have to factor out the I. So if I think about the square root of negative 25, remember I could rewrite this as the square root of negative 1 times 25, or the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 25. Remember, we have artificially defined the square root of negative 1 as this value I. Right? I represents the square root of negative 1. So we're going to replace that with I. And what is the square root of 25? Well, the square root of 25 is just 5. Now, when we write this, we don't usually write I5. Usually, we would write it as 5I. So I is similar to, or can be treated as a variable in a lot of different ways. So just as we wouldn't write x2, we would always write 2x. So we wouldn't write I5, we would write 5I. Now let's look at another part of the instructions, which says it says to express our answer in the form A plus BI. So A plus BI. So remember, A is the real part, B is the imaginary part. So BI is 5I, but what is A? Well, there isn't any A. So if I had to write it as A plus BI, I could write it as 0 plus 5I. So this is just reminding us that there is not a real portion here, there is only an imaginary portion. So our final answer is either 5I, I would accept that for credit, or 0 plus 5I. These are both fine. Alright, let's keep going. Now we have the square root of negative 18. So again, the very first thing I always do anytime I see a negative sign under the radical is I separate out the negative sign. Okay, so remember the square root of negative 1, we are defining it as this variable I, right? We're calling it I. So now I have I times the square root of 18. So now I can proceed, just as I always have, by doing a prime factorization of 18 and pulling out any perfect squares. So 18 is 2 times 9. Of course, 9 is a perfect square, 3 times 3. So I can rewrite this as I times the square root of 2 times 3 times 3. So remember, we have a pair of 3's, right? Only one of them is going to escape. So I'm going to have I times 3 times the square root of 2. Again, our normal way of writing this, we put the 3 first. So we would say that this is 3I times the square root of 2. Now at this point, you might be wondering, well, why wouldn't you write it as the 3 times the square root of 2I? Can you see why? Can you imagine why? Well, the reason is, is because of this square root, right? Especially if you have bad handwriting like I do, or you're just kind of going quickly, it can be really easy to make it look like the I is under the square root, and we don't want that. So a better way of writing it to avoid ambiguity or confusion is to write the I on the left-hand side, and then there's no question about what's under the radical. The only thing under the radical is the 2.